For a studio that's considered right up there with the likes of Disney and Pixar, Dreamworks has quite a few movies that many believe are underappreciated and deserve to be more well known. And one of the more famous examples of this would be The Road to El Dorado, a fantasy about two con artists coming across the famed city of gold and being mistaken for gods by the local natives. Now, despite the premise seemingly setting up a serious drama, this may actually be one of DreamWorks' funniest movies, and does probably deserve to be more well known as a comedy classic. And today, I'd like to go over why The Road to El Dorado might just be one of DreamWorks' most underrated movies all around. And obviously there will be spoilers ahead, so in case you'd like to check out this movie for yourself first, you probably shouldn't proceed with this video. Okay, so to start with some background first, The Road to El Dorado was inspired by what is now known as the Road to series, which were a bunch of comedy movies starring legendary comedian Bob Hope, famed singer Bing Crosby, and actress Dorothy Lamour as they travel to various locations around the world, always encountering their fair share of comical problems at every turn. And all the while, Crosby would do everything he could to win Lamour's heart. Yes, it was always Crosby who was Lamour's love interest, never Hope. Hence why in the movie, Chell becomes Tulio's love interest pretty quickly, and Miguel never gets one, being more interested in adventure as a reference to that. But I'll get back to that particular point later. So the point is, everything from the lovable rogues to the romance to the lack of language barrier, and even the comical misadventures, all of that is pretty much directly inspired by the Road to series. But what makes this movie rather impressive is that it's not just a classic throwback to a famed comedy series, but also manages to be its own thing and have its own separate identity at the same time. Meaning that it can be viewed without any knowledge of what inspired it and still work exactly as it was meant to. But what also helps it along in this regard is that unlike the Road to series, which was pretty much all about the comedy, and to great effect admittedly, The Road to El Dorado also manages to tell a pretty compelling story about friendship, loyalty, and trust beneath all of the jokes, which very much helps it stand on its own merits divorced from its inspiration. Because when you really think about it, a children's movie about con artists trying to swindle an unknowing civilization out of their gold simply sounds like a recipe for disaster with everything that could end up implying. And yet, it works perfectly. And not just because the comedy is absolutely hilarious, but also because the characters and their dynamics are done brilliantly as well. Because Miguel and Tulio, for instance, may be con artists, but from the moment you see them, the audience can't help but love them, which is compounded by the fact that it's obvious that similar to Aladdin, they were forced into the life of stealing that they have because of a poor upbringing and being pushed around by people more powerful than them. But later on, when they are in the position of power, unlike what most would expect, they don't abuse it or let it go to their heads, and instead end up benefiting the society of El Dorado by putting an end to all of the sacrifices and encouraging the citizens to love and respect each other no matter what. And it might even be for this reason that the chief lets them continue with the ruse even after it's clear he figured out that they aren't gods, because they've done so much good for his people that it doesn't matter to him that they lied. And on top of that, The relationship between Miguel and Tulio is simply spot on, effortlessly evoking the chemistry Bob Hope and Bing Crosby had. Now, as I just touched on, all of the other character interactions are great as well, but there's two characters I feel must be given special mention. The first being Chell, who just barely, and I mean barely, skirts the line of being appropriate for a kid's movie, especially the scene where she comes on to Tulio. Seriously, nobody can say that the fathers dragged to the theater didn't get their money's worth. Maybe the writers were a little too inspired by Dorothy Lamour's famous Saran and its implications. But despite that, she still works very well as an inside woman, and even her interest in them makes complete sense. Again, for a kid's movie, she's a bit out of place, but she definitely fills her role, in more ways than one, in the story perfectly. And the second would be the villain, Teskel Khan, the El Dorado high priest who only has two things on his mind: bloodshed and power. He makes for the perfect contrast to Miguel and Tulio in how he handles his power and speaker for the gods attitude, perfectly showing the type of person they could have become, but instead despise and want to be nothing like. But two things I want to give particular credit for is the writers not pulling their punches when it comes to depicting his bloodlust to show just how insane he really is, as well as his giant tiger statue battle with Miguel and Tulio once he figures out the truth. Because while at first glance it might seem out of place for a movie like this, frankly it just works. Especially because the movie builds him up as somebody who can be extremely dangerous if provoked, and they most certainly deliver on that front. Plus, it also helps evoke a genuine sense of dread in how Miguel and Tulio can possibly defeat him with such powers on his side, and yet they're able to in both the most believable, but also Miguel and Tulio fashion possible. And there's also how once he's defeated, the movie smartly doesn't have him come back directly and instead transfers the main threat to Cortez, who for many reasons makes for the perfect final villain that the characters don't even try to confront. But to say it one more time, the comedy is absolutely brilliant and on point here. Seriously, some of the jokes are hilarious and would have made Bob Hope and Bing Crosby really proud. Now, of course, there's also my ever-present issue of whether or not the movie is suitable for kids, and for the most part I would have to say yes, especially in the presentation of Miguel and Tulio. But again, in a few places, particularly when it comes to Chell and the implications of violence, it does take it a little far, but despite pushing the limits in those regards, I would still say it never crosses the line. But even still, it's not as kid-friendly as, say, The Emperor's New Groove. But then again, it wouldn't be fair to even try and compare the two, as despite both being broad comedies, they're very different. But I got more into The Emperor's New Groove in a separate video, which you can find a link in the description to, so for the moment I'll leave it at that. But either way, through a combination of great comedy, great characters, great character dynamics, a great inspiration and starting point, and not to mention some pretty great songs courtesy of the one and only Elton John, the road to El Dorado most definitely proves itself to be better than its lukewarm reception would imply. Especially because it's a movie that adults can appreciate just as much as children, and more so than a lot of other kid-oriented movies at that. Now sure, it may not be everybody's cup of tea, but that doesn't change the fact that it most definitely does its namesake and inspiration justice. But again, Even if one just looks at it as a standalone comedy, it works just as well on that front too, all around making for one rather brilliant movie. Frankly, the worst part about the whole thing may just be that all those sequels they planned to make never came to pass. Because who knows what other adventures they could have made in the spirit of Hope, Crosby, and Lamore. Alright, I think that's everything I had to say on that. So now I'd like to hear what you guys think. Do you believe that The Road to El Dorado is an underrated comedy classic that deserves to be more well known, or do you believe it has the reputation it does for a reason? Please feel free to let me know in the comments below. And as always, you don't have to agree with this video if you don't want to. You are free to feel however you want to about The Road to El Dorado, and if you think I got it all completely backwards, that's absolutely fine. And thank you all for watching. It is all very appreciated, and I hope to see you all next time.